Deep inside the central cargo bay of the alien colonial fleet, a multi-thousand-ton underground nuclear fallout bunker from Montana floated dead center in the zero-G artificial atmosphere. The alien colonists' biggest screw-up was using their tractor beam to rip Earl and his concrete fortress right out of the dirt, 50 feet deep, and beaming it straight into their flagship. The arrogant alien governor thought he'd bagged a primitive human storage unit as a trophy, completely oblivious to the fact that the 2-meter-thick cavity walls were packed with enough ammonium nitrate to level half a mountain, a fully off-the-books automated defense grid, and 3 tons of military MREs, enough to keep a man eating for 50 damn years. The second that blinding alien plasma laser burned through the bunker's outer airlock, Earl didn't feel a drop of fear sitting in front of his wall of security monitors. Hell, he was so thrilled he actually shed a tear of pure joy. The Doomsday his ex-wife had mocked him for, the one his neighbors called him crazy for prepping 30 years to see, had finally arrived in the most glorious way possible. Earl calmly pulled his tactical gas mask over his face and racked the pump of his illegally modified 12-gauge shotgun with a satisfying heavy clack. He kicked off the edge of the console, gliding toward the airlock. The moment the magnetic soles of his boots locked onto the concrete floor with a heavy thud, he fished a battered homemade booby trap out of his tactical pouch. It was 2 pounds of military-grade C4 molded into a neat little brick, wired to a spark plug head ripped right out of his '98 John Deere riding mower. The fuse was nothing but bare, bright copper wire, and the casing was still slick with half-dried diesel grease from last week's maintenance. With nimble fingers, he wedged the trap right into the load-bearing gap of the airlock's hydraulic hinges, a kill box had specifically carved out when he poured those bunker doors 30 years ago. The directional blast of hardened steel shrapnel was 100% guaranteed to sweep the entire 3-meter entryway. Not even a fly was getting through that. He hooked the thin steel tripwire securely to the inner door handle. If that door pushed inward even a fraction of an inch, the tension would violently slam the firing pin into the spark plug, leaving the uninvited guests with 0 reaction time. Trap set, he kicked off the bulkhead and drifted 10 feet backward, his mag boots slapping the floor. Without looking back, he hustled straight into the deepest reinforced concrete blast shelter in the bunker. With a heavy clank, he locked down the half-meter-thick blast door and strapped himself into the gunner's seat with a 5-point harness. He reached up, cranking the brightness knob on the security feed. On the screen, the airlock door, already glowing cherry red from the plasma cutters, was starting to buckle inward. The high-frequency metallic shutter carried all the way through the bulkhead. The Colonial Vanguard troopers outside were trying to pry the damn thing open. Earl grinned, flashing a row of tobacco-stained teeth, and flicked the shotgun's safety off. He rested his finger gently against the trigger guard. In the corner of the monitor, a biometric sensor blinked a faint green, tracking the 5 red dots of alien life signs creeping closer and closer. The cold, sterile blue light of the colonial flagship's bridge cascaded down the chitinous sensory tendrils on the side of Val's skull. He was staring at the holographic tactical display floating in front of him. Dead center in the projection sat that dusty, primitive concrete structure resting in the central cargo bay with 5 bright blue dots, representing the advanced scouting party, drifting at a steady pace toward its airlock. Val let out a rattling sneer, the tip of his tail brushing against the freezing alloy of the command console. When the tractor beam had first ripped this thing out of the dirt 50 feet beneath the blue planet's surface, High Command had panicked, thinking they'd unearthed a secret core fortification of a lesser civilization. But after scanning the entire shell, they couldn't find a single viable energy conduit. It was nothing but a lump of dirt and rock, a primitive specimen used by savages to hide from radiation. Val traced a finger lazily across the screen, broadcasting an open comms channel to the advanced squad. Conserve your plasma yields. Priority is live capture. Do not fracture the lithic shell. I intend to display this structure, complete with the primitive specimen inside, at the center of the Colonial Senate Museum. His adjutant nodded immediately, synchronizing the cargo bay's microgravity parameters to the breaching squad. The 5 Vanguard soldiers had already drifted up to the glowing red airlock. To conserve energy, they had dialed their tactical energy shields down to minimum output. The point man freed an alloy-plated boot, squared up against the buckled, inward-dented door, and dropped his center of gravity, prepping to use the microgravity's reaction force to kick the deformed slab right off its hinges. With a muffled thud, the mangled airlock door and its hinges violently blew outward. The booby trap's firing pin, pre-loosened by a millimeter, snapped forward with a sharp click. The directional blast of the 2-pound C4 funneled directly down the narrow corridor. High-speed, jagged metal shrapnel tore through the pipe like a shotgun hurricane, sparking a few pathetic overload flashes against the squad's tactical energy shields before utterly shredding the cold, glowing barriers. The fragments punched clean through their hollow, silicon-based exoskeletons. Before the 5 alloy armored bodies could even trigger a distress signal, the concussive force slammed them dead against the concrete walls. Armor splinters and pale blue fluids floated out into a slow, lazy mist in the microgravity. Earl's fingers danced across his decryption panel. A radio cracking algorithm had been sitting on for 3 decades, chewed through the Vanguard's encrypted comms protocol in 3 flat seconds. He hijacked the comms units on the 5 dead grunts' shoulder plates seamlessly. First came the static sizzle in his earpiece, followed by the deafening, eardrum-rattling echo of the blast, riding the frequency straight to the comms terminal on the distant bridge. Immediately after, the unhinged, enraged screech of a superior officer blasted through the line, peaking the audio so hard that Earl's external speaker by the console crackled and popped. He dragged the decrypted frequency into the background, locking it down tight. Tapping his finger lazily against the cold steel receiver of his modified 12-gauge, he glanced up at the bunker's infrared early warning screen, waiting to see what kind of new toys this high and mighty alien commander was going to pull out next. Val hovered at the center of the flagship bridge's command podium. His signature sensory tendrils, previously resting slack against his shoulder armor, suddenly snapped rigid as an explosive roar ripped through the communications array. Over the hijacked public frequency, the Vanguard's half-finished death screams, mixed with the horrific grind of tearing metal, violently assaulted the audio modules. On the main tactical display, the 5 bright green life signals of the advance squad shattered into dead gray static without a half-second of latency. He had conquered hundreds of lesser civilizations and had never seen an elite squad fully equipped with tactical energy shields, vaporized in under 3 minutes. His hollow knuckles popped and cracked as he seized a high-density titanium datapad and smashed it brutally against the console. With a sharp snap, shattered components spun wildly into the microgravity, grazing his adjutant's visor and leaving a shallow gouge. He pulled up the last residual frame from the infantry's body cams. All he saw was a tidal wave of jagged, irregular scrap metal flying right at the lens. The shield overload warning hadn't even ticked up half a bar before the signal died completely. Incompetent anomalies. Val hissed, the venom in his voice, causing the bridge's alloy bulkheads to vibrate. He aggressively shoved away his adjutant's attempt to intervene, bypassing 3 tiers of security encryption to pull up the deployment interface for the heavy assault phalanx. His claws jabbed the holographic projection so hard it rippled. Deploy a 10-unit heavy assault squad at maximum capacity. Full output on tactical energy shields. Equip portable plasma cutters. I want that primitive concrete structure eradicated at all costs. I want nothing left but atomized dust. The adjutant's interface scrambled into action. 10 Vanguard troopers clad in heavy armor immediately boarded a transport skiff from the docking bay, detaching from the main carrier to ride the tractor beam down to the central cargo bay. Val's furious roars bled down the hijacked comms channel, pouring straight into that unremarkable human bunker and sending the waveform visualizer on Earl's screen into a spastic frenzy. Earl bit clean through the beef jerky hanging out of his mouth, crumbs tumbling down into his thick stubble. He wasn't even a lick of panicked head been waiting on company like this for damn near 30 years. He reached out and slapped the master power switch for the external infrared sensors. 8 Cold War-era military thermal monitors flickered to life in a cold red hue, immediately painting 10 massive heat signatures on the edge of the screen. They were inching toward the bunker's airlock, following the scorch marks left by the tractor beam. The profiles on those signals were absurdly thick. Even the pale blue thermal bleed from their infantry shields was throwing phantom glows on the monitors. These boys were the real deal, strapped in heavy armor. Earl leaned back against the blast shelter's cushioning pads, resting both hands steadily on the dual control sticks of his homemade, remote-operated heavy machine gun turrets. These 2 old beauties were a pair of M60s head scavenged and welded onto a custom pen tilt mount. Ammunition boxes holding a cool 300 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary belts were bolted right to the shelter wall behind him. The thermite powder packed into those warheads was harvested from 5 years' worth of 4th of July fireworks. Head originally whipped these up for whatever post-apocalyptic raider gangs tried to take his bunker, but hell, today was as good a day as any. He flicked the safety toggles on the joysticks with a heavy clack, his eyes glued to the thermal feeds. The iron boots of those 10 heavy assault troopers crunched over the gravel outside the bunker, completely oblivious as they crossed the white line of the radiation buffer zone, the one with the skull and crossbones painted right on it. The entire squad stepped perfectly into his absolute kill box. Earl's thumb pressed down hard on the glowing red master fire button. The 2 modified M60s, welded dead to their concrete mounts, erupted in a continuous, blinding stream of muzzle flashes. 300 armor-piercing rounds, packed with fireworks-grade thermite, poured into the radiation buffer zone 10 meters away at an initial velocity of 800 meters per second, weaving an airtight crimson net of fire. The Vanguard's pride and joy, the full-output tactical energy shields, were maxed out to deflect plasma strikes, but they offered zero resistance to purely physical, large-caliber kinetic slugs. They shattered like sun-baked glass. The 7 heavy troopers taking point didn't even have time to scream. Their shields popped into violent electrical bursts before the rounds chewed right through their alloy armor, turning their hollow torsos and rear power packs into spark-spewing Swiss cheese. Earl stared at the thermals, the spent brass piling up and clanging violently against the splash guards, shaking the bunker hard enough to drop plaster from the ceiling. He could hear the muffled thuds of the 3 surviving stragglers panicking and colliding with each other through the external mics. The squad leader bringing up the rear had half his leg sheared off by a 12.7mm slug, throwing his body horizontally behind a precast load-bearing column 3 meters away. His tactical shield, hovering at half a bar of energy, barely caught the tail end of the lead storm. His plasma cutter slid out of his hand, drifting a couple of feet away as his hands were coated in concrete dust. The other 2 standing troopers panicked, firing wildly into the dark, unable to trace the source of the gunfire. Hiding behind the pillar, the squad leader pushed through the tearing agony, shakily raising his operational upper limb to tap the comms button on the side of his helmet to beg the bridge for backup. Val's holographic tactical screen suddenly exploded with a string of blinding red crosses. Out of the 10 heavy assault troopers steadily advancing, 7 of their life signals flatlined in 3 seconds flat. The remaining 3 erratic blips were pinned down in the human bunker's buffer zone, with one biometric curve violently dropping out of control. The well-groomed sensory tendrils on the side of his skull convulsed wildly. He clenched his knuckles so tight the pale white beneath his exoskeleton showed through. The tactical data pad in his adjutant's claws dropped onto the console with a heavy clang, and the shallow gouge on his visor splintered into a web of fresh, spiderweb cracks. He stared dead-eyed at the live feed. The pale red thermal residue from the armor-piercing incendiary rounds still hung over the heat sensors. The assault leader, missing half a lower limb, was huddled behind a load-bearing pillar, relying on a tactical shield with only half a bar of charge left. Pale blue fluid leaked from the ragged stump, while the two uninjured troopers shook so badly they couldn't even align the crosshairs of their plasma cutters. The squad leader's trembling finger finally depressed the comms key on his helmet. A raspy, blood-choked voice poured into every channel on the bridge. "Governor, all physical shielding has been bypassed by lower-tier kinetic weapons. Conventional plasma fire cannot penetrate this concrete fortification. Requesting authorization to deploy the infrasonic array. We will erase all targets straight through the walls." The centuries of racial arrogance housed within Val's skull shattered into dust. He had treated this chunk of human architecture dragged up by the tractor beam as an amusing, primitive specimen. Now he realized it was a death trap lined with bear traps. He virtually roared the order to unlock the infrasonic weaponry. Just as his finger hovered over the confirmation key, he watched the feed as the squad leader kicked his mangled limb out of the way, planted his wrist-mounted infrasonic generator directly onto the ground, and rested his finger over the calibration trigger. Inside the bunker, perfectly hidden in the camera's blind spot, the red warning light of a concealed acoustic detector flashed for the very first time. Earl's eyes were locked on the acoustic detector's frantically blinking red light at the base of the bunker wall. Through the soles of his boots, he could feel the faint, low-frequency vibrations. The surviving heavy squad leader was twisting the calibration dial of the infrasonic array, matching the frequency to the blinking red light perfectly. He hooked a finger around the custom IED hanging off the edge of his cover. An industrial-grade microwave casing had been hoarding for 12 years, completely welded over with rusty carpentry nails. Stuffed inside the cavity were 6 half-full cans of automotive aerosol rust inhibitor. The detonator was hardwired straight into the remote in the palm of his hand. He leaned sideways, reaching for the manual release lever of the ceiling exhaust duct, popping the rail lock with a sharp clack. Carried by the microgravity, the 30-pound chunk of iron glided silently down the ventilation network without sending a single tremor through the bulkhead. Earl stared at the grainy feed from the pinhole camera, watching the weaponized microwave drift right out of the exhaust vent on a pre-calculated trajectory, finally hovering exactly 12 inches above the crippled squad leader's head. The surviving Vanguard officer was leaning against the load-bearing column, his severed leg still leaking fluorescent blue blood. He was making the final adjustments to his wrist-mounted infrasonic generator. The two uninjured grunts had their backs to him, raising their plasma cutters to cover the entrance. All 3 of their tactical energy shields were projected forward. Not one of them spared a glance at the deadly present floating right above their heads. Earl flipped open the red safety cover on his detonator with his thumb, his knuckle already pressing into the rubber button. In his earpiece, the intercepted frequency chirped as the squad leader requested final weapon authorization from the bridge. Earl's knuckle slammed down. The rubber button sank half an inch, and the detonator let out a dull click. A muffled boom erupted from the ceiling duct. The old microwave casing, bristling with nails, blew apart into twisted scraps of junk iron. Hundreds of rusty carpentry nails sprayed downward like a buckshot shower, instantly followed by the sympathetic detonation of the 6 aerosol cans. A blossoming fireball of orange flame instantly swallowed the 3 Vanguard survivors, sucking every ounce of oxygen out of the surrounding cubic meters in less than half a second. The squad leader's tactical shield, already clinging to half a bar of power, flashed 3 times before shorting out with a harsh crackle. High-velocity nails shredded the crippled leader's life support tubing. Freezing blue blood mixed with coolant sprayed all over the bulkhead. The two uninjured assault troopers didn't even finish raising their rifles before their transparent visors were riddled with weeping nail holes. The infrasonic generator, its authorization still locked, clattered to the floor and drifted a foot away in the microgravity. Earl watched the monitors as the last 3 red dots, which had been glowing for far too long, blinked out in unison. His earpiece was dead silent, except for the static hiss of failing alien life support systems. Not a single complete scream made it through. He gave the detonator a little shake, confirming the payload had fully popped off. The bunker's airtight doors hadn't even rattled, and the 2-meter-thick reinforced concrete didn't show a single hairline fracture. He was just about to patch the hijacked comms frequency to his external speakers when a low-frequency tremor shuddered through the entire cargo bay's metallic keel. It was an enraged roar originating from the bridge, so furious it bypassed multiple bulkheads and rattled the canned goods on Earl's bunker shelves. The moment the 3 heavy troopers' life signals zeroed out, one of the sensory tendrils on the side of Val's skull literally snapped under the tension. On the cracked holographic display, the final frame transmitted showed a warped lawnmower flywheel wedged squarely into the squad leader's visor, while a leaking aerosol can detonated into a blinding burst of orange flame right in front of the lens. He had waged war across 7 colonial star systems over 3 centuries and exterminated over a dozen advanced civilizations wielding plasma shielding. Never in his life had he seen a carbon-based life form cobbled together second-hand home appliances, agricultural fertilizer, and scrap tractor parts to create a killing machine 3 times more efficient than standard military-issue fragmentation grenades. His adjutant stood frozen beside him. The spiderweb cracks on his visor spread another inch as the aftershocks from the cargo bay rattled the deck. He didn't dare breathe. He had never seen the governor in such a state of absolute, unhinged fury. Val was gripping the Vanguard star emblem on his epaulette so hard it warped out of shape. The primary directive to preserve live primitive specimens was instantly overridden by Val's neural interface. He bypassed 3 levels of security locks, hacking directly into the cargo bay's environmental control system. The moment the red warning prompt popped up, he slapped his palm print and biometric overrides against the console, force authorizing the purge. Every ventilation shaft leading into the cargo bay slammed open. 97% pure neuroanesthetic gas from the reservoir flooded the pipelines like a tsunami. Ripples of green toxicity visualized on the holographic display, rapidly expanding until they entirely smothered the intake grills of that 2-meter-thick concrete monstrosity. Val stared relentlessly at the life detection interface. He watched the gas concentration spike to 3 times the lethal dose, extinguishing every carbon-based life signal in the cargo bay. A furious, ragged gasp finally tore from his throat. With his finger hovering over the drone deployment button, he completely missed the tiny red warning light that had begun to glow steadily inside the intake vents of the bizarre human structure. Earl's eyes landed right on that glowing red warning light inside the intake vent. The muffled, steady ticking of the buzzer echoed through the concrete walls. On the monitor, the pale blue neuroanesthetic gas was creeping through the grates. The needle on the concentration gauge slammed all the way into the red. He reached over, grabbing the military gas mask hanging by the console, and locked every buckle into place with a sharp clack. The rubber seal formed airtight against his jawline. The breathing through the filter canister was as loud and heavy as the engine on his Ford pickup with 300,000 miles on the dash. He knew these Vanguard sons of bitches would play dirty. When he built this bunker, Head swapped out the triple air filtration canisters 8 separate times. This system could shrug off mustard gas for 48 hours straight. This cheap-ass anesthetic gas wouldn't even be enough to knock out his old sheepdog. Earl fished a 3-year aged Camel cigarette from his stash and wedged it into the gap of the mask. The spark from his lighter kissed the paper, and the rich tobacco smoke mixed with the charcoal scent of the filter right into his lungs. He let out a deeply satisfied curse. He hoisted his heavy tactical backpack. 3 bundles of C4 were wrapped tighter than a drum in waterproof electrical tape. Blocks of thermite rubbed against his lower back, and tucked safely at the bottom of the bag was a micro-dirty bomb had been saving for 20 years, wrapped in shockproof foam. He clipped the intercepted Vanguard comms unit to his shoulder strap, racked the shotgun to chamber 2 slug rounds, and abandoned the idea of hunkering down in his 2-meter-thick turtle shell just to take a beating. The soles of his boots crunched over 30 years of accumulated dust on the bunker's bottom floor. He rushed to the deepest corner of the storage room, shoved aside a rack of empty fertilizer bags, and exposed a rust-brown sewage pipe cover. When he welded this lock, he intentionally left a 0.5 mm false weld. Earl bent down and scooped up a polished steel pry bar from his feet. With a violent heave of his core, he jammed the flat end of the polished pry bar deep into that 0.5 mm gap. The sharp snap of the lever echoed up the metal, vibrating his knuckles numb. The rusty sewage cover popped off its welds with a bang, drifting a couple of feet away in the microgravity without echoing any unnecessary sound waves. He slipped the pry bar back onto his tactical belt. Twin jets of white vapor shot out from the respirator's exhaust valves. The unlit filter of the Camel hanging behind his ear caught a bit of moisture, and he pinched out the stray ash before it could drift. He leaned out, scanning the panoramic view of the cargo bay. The pale green neuro-anesthetic hung in semi-transparent clouds in the 0G, not even attempting to settle. His triple-layer filtration system hadn't even peaked its load. Tapping the tip of his boot against the concrete wall, he moved like an old badger that had been digging through mountain dirt for 30 years. He glided silently out of the bunker's opening, his fingers hooking flawlessly onto the reinforced ribs of the overhead ventilation network. With a backhand motion, he pulled the false sewage cover right back over the hole. From the outside, you couldn't even tell it had been popped. He squeezed through the seams of the ductwork, pushing deeper toward the belly of the mothership. The C4 thermite and micro-dirty bomb pressed stiffly against his spine. The hijacked comms unit on his chest sputtered with the broken, furious alien roars of Val smashing his console on the bridge. Every security feed in the cargo bay was deadlocked on the bunker's main entrance, completely missing the shadow of his drift. The pale green gas quickly flooded the gap head just slipped out of, sealing the bunker's entrance tighter than a vault. Earl jammed himself into the shadows of the ventilation shaft, his eyes tracing the pipe network all the way toward the bridge. In the palm of Val's hand, the sharp, twisted edges of the star emblem dug brutally into his soft tissue. The severed sensory tendril throbbed rhythmically, the lingering, piercing pain making it damn near impossible to focus. He stared at the life sign metrics on the holographic tactical display, having refreshed it 17 times. Inside and outside the bunker, it was a flat line. Even the microbial activity had been utterly wiped out by the high-concentration neurotoxin. Standing next to him, the adjutant, whose cracked visor was still hissing trace amounts of cabin oxygen, handed over the freshly updated environmental report. It confirmed the gas concentration in the cargo bay was holding steady at 3 times the lethal threshold. Val finally exhaled the breath he'd been holding for 3-star hours. The humiliating sting of losing an entire squad to the primitive weapons of lower carbon-based life forms dissipated slightly. He shook his head with renewed arrogance. Those losses were purely due to his vanguard's unpreparedness and underestimation. How could a primitive civilization, one that hadn't even mastered interstellar travel, possibly withstand the colonial vanguard's targeted environmental purge? His finger hovered over the launch button and pressed down hard. A shuttle-shaped recon drone slid off the racks of the heavy transport skiff, gliding silently toward the bunker's entrance in the microgravity. The high-definition camera fed back footage of the dusty concrete fortress, swallowed by a pale blue toxic fog, radiating absolutely no thermal signature. Val had already made up his mind. As soon as the drone confirmed the kill, he was going to deploy an engineering crew to package the entire bunker as is and haul it back to the homeworld. Drop it right in the military museum as a cautionary exhibit, titled The Futile Resistance of Lower Carbon-Based Civilizations. In the absolute corner of his screen, a sensor node in the ventilation network triggered a faint red pop-up, minor stress fluctuation in duct wall. No security risk. Val didn't even bat an eye before dismissing it. He was completely oblivious to the fact that just outside his field of vision in the shadows of the vents, Earl's fingers had just wrapped around the handle of a polished 16-pound sledgehammer tucked behind his back. In microgravity, he didn't need to put his back into it. He clung to the pipe wall like a sloth. The C4 blocks in his pack scraped against his canvas work pants, and the airflow from his filter echoed hollow inside his mask. He kept the unlit half of the Camel cigarette clamped in his teeth. Oxygen levels inside the ventilation network were under 7%. Striking a lighter in here would be throwing himself into a crematorium, and his own breathing was already wrinkling the cigarette paper. He didn't smash the hammer. He just swung it, using his wrist to lightly tap the bulkhead. The sound didn't carry through the thin air. Instead, the vibrations traveled straight from the metal pipe into the bones of his hand, running up his arm and straight into his eardrum. This was a parlor trick head, perfected from 30 years of bunker maintenance and stripping 20-some scrap pickups. A muffled thud meant a narrow coolant line. A crisp ping, like tapping a beer can, meant an empty conduit for cables. A shock that numbed the webbing of his hand meant half-meter-thick main armor plating. Following the echoes, he drifted steadily forward. His fingers brushed against a thin layer of frost on the pipe wall, and the low-frequency pulsation beneath his fingertips grew sharper. That was the harmonic resonance of the massive reactor rotors spinning up. Tracing it through the dense web of piping, he mapped out the main reactor's weakest structural stress point in no time, easily pinpointing the location of the primary engine's cooling jacket right next to it. He slipped the sledgehammer back onto his belt, reached back, and yanked the shotgun off his shoulder. With a sharp clack, he snapped the safety off. The primer of the slug felt freezing hard in the chamber. He tapped the toe of his boot gently against the ventilation louvers blocking his path. His fingers dug into the seams of the grate. A pale blue plasma glow leaked through the cracks, hot enough to make his fingertips ache. Riding the momentum of the microgravity, he slammed straight through the grate's mounting brackets. The sharp snap echoed through the metal duct just as he tumbled, shotgun in hand, into the reactor core room, bathed in a pale blue glow. The blast of scorching heat blowing in his face plastered the unlit Camel tight against his gas mask filter. The two Vanguard engineers, who had been squatting by the main engine cooling jacket tightening a pressure valve, instantly snapped their sensory tendrils toward him. They nearly dropped their plasma welding torches onto the searing hot pipes. Neither of them had seen a primitive carbon-based life form pop out of an air duct in their entire lives. They froze for a half-second before frantically scrambling for the plasma sidearms on their belts. They moved slower than a tractor's gear shift frozen in a Montana winter. Earl didn't give them a snowball's chance in hell to activate their tactical shields. He dropped his wrist and pulled the trigger. The 12-gauge slug, wrapped in the searing heat of cheap propellants, blasted out, instantly shattering the faceplate of the lead engineer's life support suit. Shards of transparent polymer, mixed with beads of vital fluid bleeding from his body, scattered into a glittering mist in the 0G. The recoil pushed Earl's heavy frame half a meter backward, his boots skidding dark streaks against the blistering hot bulkhead. The remaining engineer's tendrils shook like dry grass in a hurricane. He dropped his welding torch entirely, launching himself toward the wall like a human slingshot to slam the red panic button. Earl didn't even bother applying pressure to the trigger again. He needed to save that second slug for the high-value payload. He kicked off the bulkhead behind him. In the microgravity, his body launched forward like a lead shot straight out of the barrel. He had practiced this reverse drift dynamic caused by shotgun recoil hundreds of times in his bunker's simulated zero-G rig. Smoothly, his right hand slipped the military combat knife from his boot. The blade was honed sharp enough to carve through frozen pork in the dead of winter. Just as the surviving engineer's knuckles were about to mash the alarm button, the freezing steel blade punched right through the rubber seal of his life support collar, burying itself deep into the gap of his neck. Gray-blue alien fluid geysered out instantly, scattering into a string of semi-transparent blue beads in the zero-G. His trembling tendrils snapped perfectly straight. Then, his entire body went slack like a deflated rag doll. A fraction of a millimeter away from triggering the alarm, all the strength left his knuckles. The momentum of Earl's lunge slammed them both hard against the blistering alloy wall of the reactor. His tactical backpack scraped against the high heat paint, the thermal insulation instantly sizzling with the faint scent of ash. His left hand shot out, fingers flawlessly hooking the load-bearing railing next to the reactor. The steel safety carabiner on his waist clamped into the locking hole with a sharp clack, arresting his momentum at the absolute last second. He casually kicked the twitching corpse of the engineer away. The body spun slowly through the expanding mist of vital fluids, the discarded plasma torch bouncing against the hull with a muffled thud that traveled up the pipes toward the bridge. The dry cigarette clamped against Earl's filter was still unlit. Hanging from the alloy railing, he glanced at the main engine's cooling jacket sitting mere inches away, stamped with the insignia of the Colonial Vanguard. Earl rapidly popped the quick-release buckles on his tactical backpack. The heavy straps snapped taut in the microgravity. Freeing one hand, he swung his polished steel pry bar, cleanly slicing through the floating glob of semi-transparent blue fluid, drifting toward the glowing red reactor core. The shattered droplets were flung into an empty corner of the bay. Pushing off the railing a half step, a sharp burn on his back made his jaw twitch. His fingers accurately traced the weld seams of the main engine's cooling jacket. With 30 years of patching up farm truck radiators, he could find the weakest stress point on any pipe blindfolded. He slapped 8 blocks of thermite, coated in high-temp adhesive, straight onto the seams. The glue softened and welded itself the second it hit the scorching metal, holding fast even in zero gravity. He pulled out the micro-dirty bomb head, been saving for 2 decades, its casing still dusted with gunpowder from the old firing range. He completely bypassed the built-in encrypted electronic fuse, whipped out his wire cutters, snipped the safety wire with a snap, and wired the bare copper lead straight to the reactor's exposed energy output bus bar. Pure physical bridging. No fancy logic boards. No chance for the Vanguard's tactical network to intercept the trigger signal. Just as he twisted the last loop of wire tight, the warning vibrations from the reactor hull escalated into a drum-pounding rumble. 3 airtight blast doors around him began descending simultaneously to lock down the room. The security camera dead above him buzzed, its red light flashing on. A maximum priority video comms request from the bridge instantly sliced through the static of the hijacked radio on his chest. Val was curled up in the bridge's command chair. The severed sensory tendril was still pulsing with pain, and his thumb constantly rubbed against the utterly deformed star emblem. His adjutant stood beside him, the hiss of leaking oxygen from his cracked visor brushing against Val's gauntlet. Both their eyes were glued to the main screen. The shuttle-shaped drone was less than 2 meters from the bunker entrance, and the tactical data pad flashed green, confirming 0 life signs in the sector. In the very next second, a deafening drum-like resonance blasted through the bulkheads of the entire bridge. Every holographic display detonated into a blinding blood red. The main reactor's energy output curves were tanking at an insane speed. The stress alarms on the main engine's cooling jacket punched straight through every authorization lock on the tactical network. The ear-piercing warning sirens practically peeled off the bridge's acoustic insulation. Val flinched violently from the pain, nearly launching out of his command chair. His immediate instinct was that an unknown, advanced hostile fleet had ambushed them in deep space. He snatched the override panel for the flagship tier infrasonic array right out of his adjutant's claws. But the moment he pulled up the core room's security feed, he froze like a specimen dipped in liquid nitrogen. That Earthling, the human who was supposed to be dissolved down to his DNA by 97% pure nerve gas, was casually straddling the glowing blue output bus bar of the main reactor. An unlit Camel cigarette hung off his gas mask filter. 8 blocks of thermite were blatantly plastered to the cooling jacket's weld seams, while 2 plasma sidearms lazily drifted in 0G right beside him. The 300 years of tactical doctrine Val held regarding lower primitive civilizations was utterly pulverized. Staring at the frantically flashing maximum priority connect button on the comms interface, he punched it with trembling fingers. Shoving his blue-purple face into the holographic lens, he opened his mouth to spit out terms of negotiation. But he watched as Earl shot him a glance, his thick, calloused thumb already resting on the red detonator switch inside his tactical pack. With his free hand, Earl scooped up an over-ear headset floating by his boot and cranked the frequency knob right to the max. Ear-splitting, gritty country rock flooded the channel, vibrating so hard the filter on his gas mask started humming to the beat. He looked up at the holographic comms feed. Val's blue-purple face froze, just as the words of negotiation reached his throat. The pulsing sensory tendril on his skull spasmed uncontrollably. The mangled star emblem slipped through his fingers and clattered onto the bridge console. Earl bit down on the unlit camel dangling from his mask, offering a cold smirk as he tilted his chin up. "This is Doomsday Radio, baby. No weather forecast today, just a big old bang." His thumb slammed down, snapping the detonator shut with a heavy click. In the microgravity, the fuses on all 8 thermite blocks sparked into a blinding white glare simultaneously. The micro-dirty bomb bridged to the reactor's output bus bar clicked right into its firing slot. In the distance, the cargo bay echoed with the muffled thump of the recon drone, flying blindly into the bunker's cloud of nerve gas. Earl's ankle safety carabiner had already been pre-loosened to its last tooth. The low-frequency hum of the reactor core behind him skyrocketed threefold. Searing waves of heat were already creeping up through the grips of his boots, and the very first sparks from the thermite blocks began kissing the silver-gray metal of the engine's cooling jacket. Val's retinas were instantly burned with an afterimage by the blinding white flash from the core feed. The Vanguard star emblem slipped from his grip, clanging against the tempered glass of the console. The severed sensory tendril on his skull throbbed with such agonizing pain, he nearly blacked out. The 8 blocks of thermite took exactly 0.2 seconds to melt right through the silver-gray wall of the main engine's cooling jacket. Depressurized cooling plasma, burning at thousands of degrees, violently erupted outward. The reactor's energy readouts spiked into the red so fast that the ship's tactical system couldn't even output 3 lines of warning text. The irreversible chain detonation instantly locked out all safety shutdown protocol. High-pressure oxygen violently exploded from the cracks in the adjutant's visor. The piercing shriek of the leak mixed with the ship-wide resonance alarms to create pure chaos. The bridge's alloy floor began to warp and buckle like melted taffy. Unsecured plasma sidearms and tactical data pads went flying in every direction through the microgravity. Val pounded on the communications console like a madman, trying to broadcast an abandoned ship order to the heavy assault transport docked in the bay. But the overloaded current had already fried the comms module. The stench of scorched insulation instantly choked the entire bridge. Through the shaking viewport, Val caught a peripheral glimpse of the human who was supposed to have been vaporized. Earl's pre-loosened ankle carabiner snapped open. Riding the concussive wave of the explosion, he dove perfectly into the adjacent maintenance bay he had scoped out earlier. Yanking open the hatch to an abandoned Vanguard escape pod, he locked it with a heavy clack. The ejection thrusters fired immediately, rocketing out of the bay and barely scraping past the rolling tidal waves of plasma fire. In the very next second, the entire Colonial Vanguard flagship detonated in the pitch-black void of deep space, blossoming into a blinding fireball miles across. The shockwave shredded the metal hull, reducing it to molten iron dust. Miles away through the viewport of the escape pod, the wild, pounding beat of country rock music could still faintly be heard vibrating through the hull. Hanging from Earl's gas mask filter, that unlit half of a Camel cigarette bobbed slightly under the dim emergency lights, dancing to the floating sparks.
Finishing Earl's story, I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. To be honest, what draws me so deeply to the HFY genre isn't the sleek interstellar armadas, pristine futuristic societies, or sudden evolutionary leaps. It's that raw, gritty contrast. There is a deeply satisfying, absurdly dark humor in watching a hyper-advanced, impossibly arrogant alien empire get absolutely dismantled by a stubborn, off-the-grid prepper from Montana, armed with scavenged tractor parts, a cheap welder, and way too much free time. It's the ultimate Florida man in space trope, and writing it is an absolute blast. But in this production pipeline, the script is just the skeleton. The real magic happens when all the pieces of the puzzle come together to create a full sensory experience. Hearing that rugged, deadpan, gravelly narration perfectly nail the Doomsday Radio punchline during the audiobook audio mix is what truly brought Earl's cynical spirit to life. And when it came time to dial in the visual assets, pushing the Nanobanana model on the Flow platform to capture that exact chaotic blend of glowing alien plasma, neon tactical shields, and rust belt diesel grime, that's an indescribable high for a creator. It perfectly visualized that violent clash of civilizations. Humanity might not be born with tactical energy shields or silicon-based exoskeletons, but we've got duct tape, C4, 12-gauge slugs, and a whole lot of sheer audacity. We are survivors who weaponize our own junk. That's exactly why I love developing and producing these sci-fi stories, taking the most abrasive, unpolished human soul and throwing it straight into the grandest, most terrifying cosmic scale just to watch the galaxy blink first.